Hey guys, it's Katie. Thanks for stopping by my channel. Today's video is going to be all about baking bread. I want to get you started baking bread. If you've been thinking about baking bread, or if you wish you knew how to bake bread, or even if you know how to bake bread but you don't know how to bake bread during a global pandemic when you're sheltering in place and don't have access to all the ingredients you usually have access to, I have a list of tips and tricks here. Hopefully I have something of value across the board to anybody who's interested in baking bread. If you do find anything of value in this video, I would love for you to give my video a thumbs up, rating it, leaving a comment in the comment section down below, sharing it on social media. I'm looking to get some engagement on these videos because these videos that I'm doing, I'm going to do one on bread baking, and I'm going to do one on gardening, and maybe do one on fermentation, are just to get you started, and they're going to purposely be very like elementary level, basic, what you need to know just to get started. I have a lot of things to say about baking bread, but I'm not trying to overwhelm anybody, especially somebody that's not used to baking bread or maybe is already overwhelmed because of what's happening in the world. So I'm purposely keeping these beginning recipe or beginning videos are going to be more bare bones, and then anything that I skip over or anything you have questions about or anything you want to dive deeper on, I'm totally available to make additional videos. So those who have grasp the basics and want to go deeper can go with me to those other videos, and then we can go deeper and deeper and deeper until you know as much as I know. So please leave comments, ask your questions, give me your video suggestions, whether it's about bread baking or anything else that I might know about that you're looking for information on, okay? So I'm just going to run through the list of tips that I have. These are, I just jotted these down as I thought of them the last few days, but these are like tips that, like I said, I don't want to overwhelm the beginner with all the little nuances and all the little tweaks. These aren't just little tips that maybe make your bread like a percentage better. These are the things that are going to turn your loaf from not great but okay to good enough to serve to your family. So yeah, I'm a big fan of the keep it simple stupid train of thought. So if I'm telling you that something is making an impact on the final product of your bread, then it's actually making like a large impact. And then, like I said, in those subsequent videos, if we go deeper on little things, we can talk about the little tweaks if you want to perfect your bread. But we're going from you got a brick and now you want to have an actual loaf of bread. We're doing that big jump today. All right, so I think I have like 10 or 12 little tips here. They're not in any particular order. And actually the first one I'm going to talk about is actually one that I've personally learned myself most recently. And it's to use gluten, high gluten flours, bread flours, high protein flours, or added gluten to all-purpose flour. And I just started using gluten in my flours for the last like 8 years. All the bread that I've made has been made just with all-purpose flour. Sometimes I'll use like whole wheat flour too, but just the plain flour, the same kind of flour that you make pancakes with or that you make, muffins and cookies with. I started adding gluten to my all-purpose flour to make my own bread flour, and everything, like across the board, everything is easier when you add gluten. The dough comes together so much easier. It's more forgiving when you're kneading it by hand if you don't have a stand mixer. Or even if you do have a stand mixer, it just comes together beautifully when you add gluten. Shaping, again, it makes all of the steps just so more forgiving. So whether you're not so great on kneading bread or you're not sure if you're doing it right, having gluten just kind of masks any mistakes that you make in like kneading, in shaping, improving all of these topics. It just across the board makes it better. It makes your finished loaf more like what you're probably used to. It has more of a stretch to it, so if you're making sandwiches and you're holding your sandwich, it doesn't just like crumble into pieces. And I've never really heard anybody mention this as a benefit to using gluten, but I feel like it makes the bread store better, so it doesn't dry out as quickly, and you can make a loaf of bread and use it over the course of 3 or 4 days rather than needing to eat it up in 1 or 2 days before it dries out and gets kind of crumbly and stale tasting. So that's my number one tip, is to use gluten. So you can get bread flour. I personally don't like to have another whole flour that I have to keep and maintain on my in my pantry. So what I do is I just get gluten and add it to all-purpose flour. So this is the gluten that I use. It's Bob's Red Mill. You've probably seen this brand in your grocery store. They have a ton of products. There's usually a whole section of it. Gluten is kind of hard to find though, so if you can find it, grab it. This bag, it's 22 ounces, is usually around $7 or $8. and you only need 1 tablespoon per cup. So if your bread recipe calls for 4 cups of flour, you add 4 tablespoons. If it's 6 cups of flour, you use 6 tablespoons. I'm kind of getting down to the last part of this bag, so I'm actually using a little bit less, but it's still helping somewhat. So I'll show you so you can see. It's called Vital Wheat Gluten. And like I said, it can be hard to find even in the best of circumstances. I have to go to sort of higher end grocery stores, so places like Wegmans I find it. Locally to me I find it at Giant. Whole Foods should have it. And where you find it can be kind of tricky too in the store. Sometimes the Bob Red Mills section is in the cereal section because they have a lot of like oatmeals and hot cereals and things like that. Sometimes it's in the baking aisle, and it's actually less often in the baking aisle, and sometimes it's in like the health food section. So this actually can be used to make like a fake meat, like a meat substitute. So you might find it in like the, funnily enough, that in Wegmans there's like the gluten-free section, and then there's like the vegetarian and vegan section, and it's like right there kind of next to, not in the gluten-free section, but next to the gluten-free section. So you can also find it like at Vitacost online and things like that. I wanted to say a tip over the board: if you're thinking about buying pantry staples at Amazon, you're always going to pay more. And not just because of you know, what's happening in the world right now. I don't want to even say it, but it's not the place to buy your pantry staples. The better place to buy your pantry staples, if you are forced to buy things online, is using like a regular grocery store or a store that sells groceries website. So I'm specifically thinking about Target and I guess Walmart. I don't normally shop at Walmart, but I know at Target, you know, the groceries they have at Target are reasonably priced, and the prices on their website are the same as in the store. If you buy things from Amazon, you're paying for the convenience of them shipping it to you, or if you're using like a grocery pickup service, there's probably an added cost. So I know that they sell this sometimes at Target, but I haven't seen it at Target.com since everything's out of stock at Target.com recently, but I have gotten it from them in the past. So Vital Wheat Gluten would be definitely a tip. If you can't find it or you don't have it, it's not like an absolute, but it does make a significant impact on the finished bread. Okay, the number 2 tip, if you've ever watched any of my bread baking videos or my meal prep videos, you've probably heard me talk about this, is make a proofing box. When your bread is rising, whether it's the dough rising or the loaves rising before you bake them, you need to be in a hot, humid environment. The very best thing to do is to have a proofing box to kind of keep the heat and the moisture in. Not very many people who aren't commercial bakers have a proofing box, but if you have a microwave, then you do have a proofing box. Also, if you don't have a microwave, you can do the same thing with like a cooler and some boiling water. So like I said, if you've seen any of my videos about bread baking, you've probably seen this. But what I do is when I'm finishing up my bread, I put a cup of water in my microwave, in a microwave-safe vessel, of course. I have a jar that just lives in my microwave all the time, and I put water in it, and I boil it, or just cook it in the microwave until it boils. So I usually cook it for like 5 minutes, let it come to a nice rolling boil, and then just leave it in there. Whenever you go to put your bread in, you open it up, put the bread in, and close it. And then that cup of water will provide heat. It will, of course, provide steam, and it's all trapped in the microwave, and it will help your bread rise. So the heat will help your bread rise, and the moisture will help there from developing a skin or a dried out surface on your bread so it can rise to its fullest potential, and you won't get like a crusty crust on your bread before it bakes. So number 3 is about yeast. I'm hearing that it's hard to find yeast in stores and online. It's like out of stock across the board. So if you have some yeast, but not a lot, I would cut back the amount of yeast in recipes. You don't need to use the full amount of yeast that a recipe calls for. So if you make a normal loaf of bread, a lot of times those recipes call for like 2 to 3 teaspoons of yeast or more to make a batch of bread. But if you've ever made like the New York Times no-knead bread that was really popular a few years ago, it calls for like a pinch of yeast, and it makes just as much bread. And the reason is because yeast is alive and it grows and it kind of fills the capacity that you need. It just, if you start with less, it takes more time. So if you can give yourself more time, then you can cut back on the yeast, and that way you can make it stretch a little bit farther. Again, using the proofing box and having a nice hot, warm environment will help the yeast thrive. So if you're starting with yet less yeast, you'll get the rise. It'll be a faster process than if you don't have a proofing box. So using those two tips in conjunction can really help. If you don't have any yeast on hand, you can do a sourdough starter. I have a video on my channel talking about sourdough. I don't even want to talk about sourdough in this video, but if you want to hear more about sourdough, I can make an additional video. Your last option, if you have no yeast, no way of getting yeast, and you don't want to do a sourdough starter, is to make unleavened bread. There are some, like you can make tortillas without yeast. You can make crackers. There's a couple different things, so you can still have a bread product to help fill your, your family's stomachs without actually making bread. So that's tip number 3. Let's see what my other tips are. Okay. Tip number 4 is about flour. If you're having trouble finding flour or you have some and you want to stretch it, think of other things that you can add to your bread. A big one that you can add is ground up oatmeal. Take regular rolled oats or quick cooking oats, whatever you have, grind them up in a food processor till they're a flour-like consistency, and you can use that to swap out some flour. You don't want to go too heavy on the oatmeal, like you can't make I don't think, maybe you can, I don't think you can though, make a full like oatmeal loaf. But you can replace some if you have a lot of oats but you don't have a lot of flour, sort of thing. Okay, my next tip is if you've tried to make loaves of bread and they don't turn out, I personally think loaves of bread that you would slice into make sandwiches or something like that to replicate the sliced bread you get at the store, those are one of the more difficult types of bread to make, in my opinion. So if you're having trouble making a loaf of bread turn out for you, I would do something like a focaccia. Something like rolls, like dinner rolls, are super easy. You can still make sandwiches out of rolls, and I feel like not only are they easier, but they come up a little quicker. Like the rise is a little quicker, and then you can make smaller amounts more often, sort of thing. So there's a lot of flexibility in bread. If you're thinking, I need to make bread, I need to make a loaf of bread, you need to kind of expand your thinking a little bit. Say, I need bread because I want to make sandwiches, you can make rolls. If you want bread because I need something to serve with soup, then you can make like breadsticks or focaccia or something like that. So you have that option as well. So the next tips are going to be all about like the actual process of mixing up the dough. That can be hard for some people. If you have a stand mixer, you can use it, but you absolutely don't need to use it. Again, think about the other steps that I said. If you have gluten, it will help the mixing process come together a lot nicer and easier. Some tip that I learned a long time ago is you don't put all the ingredients in the bowl and stick your hands in there, because you're just going to it's going to get in between your fingers, it's going to get under your fingernails, it's just going to be a mess, and it's never going to, they say it should clean the bowl and clean your hands when the dough comes together, and that's not exactly true. If you stick your hands right in wet water and flour, when they come out, they're never going to come clean. So what I do is I start with a rubber spatula and I get it to as thick of a dough as I can and still stir with a like a rubber spatula, and then I stick my hands in it. It just makes it more pleasant overall, and it helps prevent you adding too much flour, thinking that it's sticking to your hands, when really what it's sticking to is the bread dough that's already on your hands from when you stuck it in to like water and flour. So you have that, and then when you're whether it's when you're shaping or it's when you're kneading, it always says use a floured surface. I don't use a floured surface, and I usually don't use floured hands. If you get bogged down in your kneading and your hands have flour and dough all over the backside, take a minute, get as much as you can off, wash your hands, and then you can give it a couple minutes and let it rest and relax a little bit, and then attack it again, or come to it with wet hands instead of floured hands and try it that way as well. You don't want to add too much flour because that's going to give you a heavy, dense loaf. So you want to have it easy to handle and it doesn't stick to your hands if your hands are a little wet. You can also use a little oil on your hands, and that's sort of the same thing. Oil your countertop, oil your hands, so it's not sticking to your hands and you're not needing to add too much flour and ending up with a brick of a loaf instead of a nice fluffy loaf. My next tip is you want to get it out of the pans as soon as it comes out of the oven. This is another reason why making rolls sometimes is better than making a loaf of bread, because if you pull the cookie sheet out that has your rolls sitting on top of it, they can just sit there and cool, and maybe the very bottom will get a little soggy, but it's not like the whole 3 sides and the bottom is getting soggy like in a loaf of bread. But if you pull out your loaf of bread, you want to get it out of the pan as soon as you can. So it'll be very hot at first, but if you give it maybe like 5 or 10 minutes, you want to get it to come out. And ideally your loaf should just fall out of the pan. If you just hold the pan with hot pads and tip it out, it should come out. If it's sticking to your pan, then you need to reassess how you're greasing your pans. Now, some people have non-stick pans, and I don't have nonstick pans. I use stoneware pans, and I use like untreated metal pans. And I have found that I have a lot better luck of having my bread come out of the pan when I grease with a solid fat. So that's another tip, is use a solid fat to grease your pans. So I use Crisco or lard. I've used bacon grease in the past. I don't use like actual butter. I use a vegan butter because I'm dairy free, but I don't usually use that, but you could try butter as well. Instead of using the spray oil, I would stick with a solid fat and rub it in there with your hands, or use a pastry brush. You want to have it so your bread just falls out. So using the solid fat to grease your pans and then getting it out of your pans. Those are two different tips, but I kind of told you them together. Okay, another one is you want to cool your bread completely before you cut it. If your bread is doughy in the middle, it could be that you're cutting it too soon. When it comes out of the oven, it's going to smell good and you're going to want to cut into it. And sometimes I will, just because it's so delicious fresh out of the oven. But if you want the rest of your loaf to last or to have a nice texture to it, you need to let time for that steam and heat to kind of dissipate throughout the whole loaf. So you want to cool it completely. Ideally, you would cook it, and you wouldn't even, that would be tomorrow's loaf of bread, or that night's if you make it in the morning. So hours and hours and hours have to have passed before you cut into the loaf. Another reason why your bread might be doughy in the middle is if it hasn't actually cooked through. Sometimes the top will brown, but it's not cooked in the middle. So people thump it and do all sorts of stuff to it, but really the foolproof way is to take its temperature. Just like you would stick a thermometer right into a piece of whatever meat or something to make sure it was cooked through. You can stick a temperature probe or an instant read thermometer right into your loaf of bread. Try to get it right in the middle like you would if you were taking the temperature of any other food, and it needs to be 200 degrees or more. And if you get it in there and it's 200 degrees or more, then you know the inside is set. And as long as you let it cool completely before you slice it, then you should end up with a much better loaf than if you pull it prematurely or cut it prematurely. You pull out a loaf of bread and take the temperature and it's not quite 200 degrees, put it back in the oven. Put some aluminum foil if it's starting to get too brown on the top, but you definitely want to bake it more. If you pull a loaf of bread out of the oven and you take it out of the pan and you cool it, and then you cut into it and it's still a little gooey or doughy inside because it didn't fully cook in the middle, then I have definitely done this. Put that slice right back on it, put it right back in the pan, even a stone cold loaf of bread, put it back in the oven, and sometimes you can save it that way. Bake it again, bring it back up to temperature again, get it back to 200 degrees, and that can help fully cook. If you've ever gone to like the freezer section and gotten those, they're kind of like par cooked loaves of bread, and then you bake it at home so your house smells like freshly baked bread. It's the same idea. So if you find that your loaf of bread isn't fully cooked and you put it back in the pan, you can rebake it, get it up to 200 degrees, take the temperature, and then your bread should turn out. It might be a way to save a loaf of bread. Just making sure I get all of the things that I talked about. The last tip, I just have one last tip. If you're making multiple loaves of bread because you don't want to be baking bread every single day, when you bake them, freeze them as soon as they cool. You want to cool them completely and then freeze them the same day. Don't have your multiple loaves of bread and then decide, oh, this has been sitting around for a while, and you want to freeze it then. Ideally, you'll pull it out of the oven, take it out of the pan, let it cool completely, and put it, wrap it up in however you want to wrap it up, gallon-sized bag, wrap it up in saran wrap, something like that. Put it in the freezer. If it's a whole loaf, it's going to survive better, and if it's put in the freezer as soon as it's done cooling after the day that you bake it, then it's going to come out and be more like freshly baked. Alright, I think that's all I have for you. Like I said, if there's anything that I went over too quickly or that you want to hear more about, or if you have specific questions, please, I want to hear lots of comments down in the comment section down below. Next, I'm going to be doing a gardening video, so be on the lookout for that. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed before, and I'll talk to you guys next time. Thanks for watching. Bye.